Hello and good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Kaufman from Pollinator Partnership, and I'd like to welcome and thank you all for joining us for the fifth and final workshop, Long-Term Habitat Management and Monitoring, as part of the comprehensive Project Wingspan Pollinator and Habitat Technical Training Workshop Series. We have a very full agenda today. So with that, we'd like to invite all of you to actively participate in the workshop by submitting questions for each of the presenters through the Q&A function box, which can be found either in the bottom or right-hand corner of your screen. Questions can be entered both during and after each of the presentations. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our first speaker, Daniel Zay. Daniel Zay is the State Resource Conservationist for the NRCS in Michigan. He manages the staff of the Ecological Sciences section, which provides support for technical aspects of the agricultural conservation for the Farm Bill programs and NRCS field offices. Dan plays an important role in the implementation of Farm Bill wetland compliance and in providing training and technical support on conservation biology. Prior to NRCS, Dan worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers 404 regulatory program in the Louisville district, where he provided wetland permit review and enforcement throughout Indiana. After graduating from Purdue University, he worked as the roadside coordinator for the Indiana Department of Transportation and then worked as a regional ecologist for the Indiana DNR Division of Nature Preserves, managing 43 nature preserves in west central Indiana. In 1984, he entered the private sector as a consultant, leading wetland permitting and mitigation projects, biological studies, and conducted NEPA clearance efforts for transportation and airport projects throughout the Midwest. Please welcome Daniel Zay.
Good morning. My name is Dan Zay, and I'm the State Resource Conservationist with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the NRCS. The NRCS's mission is to support voluntary conservation in agriculture to conserve soil, water, wildlife, toward providing a sustainable food production system. We do this through providing technical and financial assistance to producers that participate in Farm Bill programs. I've worked for over 30 years in native habitat restoration and management, including prairies, savannas, woodland, and wetland habitats, with improved pollinator habitat being the result of many of these efforts. I was the charter director and the first president of the Central Indiana Land Trust, while they're gaining experience in conservation easements. My prairie seed collection in 1994 provided the foundation stock for the JFNU Native Plant Nursery, now known as the Cardno Native Plant Nursery. Understanding that landscape fire provides a critical influence in native habitats, I became experienced in prescribed fire and provided contract burn services. I continue to provide training on prescribed fire. I've also worked on habitat projects in 5-state area in the Midwest. The focus of my talk today is on long-term management considerations and strategies to support pollinator habitats. I'll use the term habitat planning or restoration interchangeably with pollinator habitat for convenience in this presentation. Quality habitat projects take an investment in time, effort, material, and money toward producing a productive pollinator habitat that provides all the resources needed to support healthy pollinator populations. These diverse habitats are the foundations of life-sustaining healthy ecosystems that are increasingly rare in Michigan and throughout the Midwest. I'm going to share what I feel are some important long-term management considerations, including some of the less glamorous considerations and strategies that may contribute to the success of habitat projects. In my experience, I've seen otherwise exceptional projects at sites that have failed due to considerations beyond the important initial efforts to establish the projects. The importance of these considerations is somewhat sensitive to the size and the ownership of the projects, of course. Strategies or systems and management considerations, which also could be termed activities, that are important to the success of pollinator habitats include developing clear objectives with the owner. This is certainly a front-end effort, but it does have implications for the long-term success of the project. An example would be at times for pollinator projects in the NRCS, we could be using a term limited financial assistance program. And it's important to understand with the landowner whether their intent is to provide the pollinator habitat just for the term of the program, or whether they're using the program as a gateway to long-term pollinator habitat planting. This has implications for like the seed mix design. If you have a 5 or 10 year term planting program, you may not want to put a lot of additional effort into real conservative seed mixes. Maybe some seed mixes that provide pollinator habitat, but are less costly. Also, an important consideration is designing a project to accommodate all facets of management out into the future. If your prescribed fire is a real critical tool for maintaining healthy pollinator habitats, and you certainly want to design your project with considerations for safety, maybe smoke management, and buffers, appropriate buffers around other areas. At times I've seen CRP projects proposed where there's a nice pollinator planting area, and then I'll see pine trees proposed for being scattered in throughout. And when I see that, I know that there's not an understanding of the need to provide prescribed fire in that case. Another important consideration is to optimize the project size. Sometimes the size of a project at the onset is constrained by costs, and otherwise there might be a lot larger area to provide pollinator habitat in, given appropriate phasing, maybe more efforts and more money available to make it larger. So consider the design, additional phases of expansion. Sometimes you can collect seed off the initial planting and use that to enlarge the planting in the future. Understanding that generally speaking, larger projects have a little more permanence and more importance on the landscape. Long-term management plans are another important consideration. This comes into play often to maintain consistency if there's a turnover in management personnel or staff. An example of that might be a pollinator habitat planting at a parks department, where the director, the initial director, was very supportive of it. Maybe that position changes, or maybe the naturalist that was in charge of managing it changes positions. And so new people will be brought in, and the long-term management plan would be a key document in bridging the gap between those personnel changes and maintaining consistency of management for the project. There's some important protection strategies that need to be considered for the long-term viability of these projects. Conservation easements, whereas conservation easements aren't always applicable to a given project. Sometimes there's a nice project on a land that isn't where maybe conservation isn't the main objective of the use of the land, but they wanted to have a pollinator planting. And if it's large enough, and if the landowner agrees, a conservation easement in the name of maybe a local land trust or maybe even the DNR might be appropriate. So it's an important tool in assuring the long-term viability. Building a constituency. Certainly when these projects go in, there's oftentimes a core group of people that are enthusiastic about the planting to get it installed and established and even managed on the front end. But it's important to reach out and include a larger constituency of support for these projects to maintain their continuation into the future. Part of this is a continuing education program, so I think anybody should consider maybe getting something on the calendar on a recurring basis, maybe an Earth Day celebration or a midsummer wildflower walk around the pollinator planting. This feeds into building a constituency and gets more and more support and provides more permanence for the pollinator area into the future. Again, adjacent land use changes is an important protection consideration. Understanding what the zoning, maybe the potential for land use changes might have implications for where the pollinator planting is established, what buffer contingencies might be appropriate given long-term management needs, and things like that. So it is important. Of course, it's more important with larger type projects, but it's an important consideration nonetheless. And one of the things that's working against pollinator plantings is what I call a perception of permanence. If you're looking at a protected woodlot, you understand the trees, maybe a couple generations old, and people can easily reflect on the permanence of that type of natural feature. Pollinator plantings, on the other hand, are often herbaceous complexes that many people don't perceive. They're different types of plants than they're used to. It may just look like an unmaintained old field to many folks. These are features that can be converted to other uses with the passage of a tractor and a cultivator pretty quickly. And that's why as you provide education and outreach to folks, you need to send that message how important the pollinator plantings are and how important they are to remain on the landscape. There's a few other considerations that would be important, and those include protection of local genotype plants. When we secure seed for these pollinator plantings, there's oftentimes native seeds available from different vendors, but oftentimes they're not of local genotype selections. So the phenology of the given plants in the mix might not specifically match what the pollinators in the area need for their life cycles. So if there's opportunities to include local genotypes to provide that better match, that should be considered. And that might be something that you could do over beyond the initial establishment of the planting to collect those on the side and introduce them as appropriate into the future. Continuous inventories are an important part of considerations for these plantings. You want to make sure that you're getting an expression of the seed mix that you installed, and you also want to have an idea of whether new introductions are being expressed in the planting as well, and whether your management has implications for the species that are being represented. And along with that, the inventory might indicate an opportunity for or need for species introductions that might be relevant to the plant community as it develops. The final consideration that I want to mention is monitoring and implementing some of the evolving management science. Pollinator plantings are certainly popular over the past several years. The science of restoration ecology, restoring prairies and native grasslands has been going on for a few decades now, but there's still an emergent science. And so there's lots of new information coming out that may have some implications for your pollinator planting. In native prairie plantings, the influence of hemiparasites has garnered some interest recently, including species like Commanda umbellifera, umbellata, and Pedicularis canadensis, and their influence in modifying the plant community to the benefit of flowering plant expression. Another topic under the evolving science would be growing season prescribed fire. It's become understood as an important tool to help manage the encroachment of woody species into these plantings, and also has important influence for microhabitat development and diversity of species. I'm going to take a few minutes now to talk about some projects that have implications for the strategies that we've talked about. The first two are Granville Cemetery, which was a component of the historic Wea Plains, and Shiloh Cemetery, which is a remnant of the 12-mile prairie. These are remnant prairie habitats, but important pollinator habitat components and historic remnants of features that are virtually gone today, except for these remnants. The Granville Cemetery was part of the Wea Plains. It was a larger prairie area southwest of Lafayette. This was managed in cooperation with the township trustee. This is the feature. It's about 2 to 3 acres. It's kind of dark here because it's not too long after a spring burn. You can see mixed rural agriculture around it, farmland, non-crop areas. But this was never protected with a conservation easement. It's just a cooperative agreement with the township trustee. And what happens? A private residence moves in right next door within 61 feet of the cemetery. They aren't interested in the prairie, so the township trustee starts mowing it again instead of using the prescribed burn. This feature was unique not only in that it was a historic remnant, but it had a rare plant that was new to the flora of Indiana, Camassia angusta, which was previously misidentified as scoloides. And it's a disjunct location too. The next nearest populations of angusta are about 100 miles southwest into Illinois. But now this area is mowed again. Shiloh Cemetery, another unique remnant that had important pollinator habitat. You can see there's non-crop area around that with some imagination could have been included in the management of this feature. But again, it was just a cooperative agreement with the township trustee. They had change in the trusteeship there, and this is now mowed again. And again, it was a remnant of a 30,000 acre historic prairie, till-bearing prairie in Indiana, which is virtually gone now. Some project challenges that have implications for these strategies we've talked about. Watertown Charter Township has a Partners for Wildlife and a Pocket Prairie, and Waukusta Elementary Prairie, and the Fort Custer IED Reaction Course. The first project is Watertown Township Partners for Wildlife. This is a 150 acre property deeded to the township that was part of borrow area for the interstate construction. These two features here, these two areas were borrow areas that were planted to Partners for Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife project. And this little pocket prairie that I've been reseeding with collected seed, prairie seed from around the state, just scattering it and burning it. This is the pocket prairie. It's a unique feature, has about 25 different prairie species in it, collected from the regional area. You can see quite a bit of flowering activity there. And there is a need for some woody control. We have burned this a couple of times. And then this is the Partners Project. It can be viewed from the interstate. The adjacent property owners go out and experience this a little bit. So this is locked in for a 10-year period. But the challenge here is that the township has not embraced the idea of putting a conservation easement on this feature. And so it could be lost to pollinator habitat in the future. I would just go back to this map to show how the relationship between the adjacent residential, the interstate, and the fact that this green space property provides an appropriate buffer between the non-compatible uses. In the absence of this feature, this could be built out with houses possibly, and then require $1 million a mile noise barrier. Wachusett Elementary, this is a 20-year-old pollinator planting of prairie species established by Cliff Welch, Professor Emeritus of MSU. He managed it for many, many years for the elementary school. My children went to the school. I picked up the management of it since Cliff was getting on in age. It's very productive for pollinator habitat. The challenge here is to build a constituency. Everybody at the school is in favor of this feature by its permanence, but I've been trying to build a little bit more hands-on involvement from the school, and that's been a challenge. Understandably, teachers are real busy, but I'd certainly like to have a few of them come out and put a couple hours into burning it every year with me. So that's an ongoing challenge. The Fort Custer IED course. This is within a 7,500 acre National Guard training facility. The course was cut from the woodlot, developed with prairie grasses to facilitate the type of training they wanted here. The objective of the property is training. The fact that that the grasslands facilitate the type of training in this training area is important. It does have important pollinator habitat. The challenge we have here is that there's turnover in management. Every 3 to 5 years, the base commander will turn over, and then the environmental group who's supportive and is skilled in managing this feature somewhat has to sell the idea of prescribed fire every few years. This gives you a little idea of the scope of the property. With the prescribed burn in 2019, there was a couple-year hiatus due to base commander turnover. We did a growing season burn this year, in large part to push back on the encroachment of woody species to keep this important feature available for the intended training purpose. Some project opportunities. These are areas that are tended to be managed in perpetuity, but there's some opportunities to expand on their value. Smith Cemetery is responsible for my interest in Prairie at all. It's a little 2.5 acre prairie cemetery on the west side of Indiana, along north of Lafayette, along State Road 63. It's a 4-lane split median highway. It's one of only two deep black soil mesic prairies left in the state of Indiana. This is what it looks like not too long after an April burn. Very rural character. It does have parking access. And this is how it's situated in the landscape. And you can see there would be opportunities to utilize this as a seed source to expand and even protect this small watershed area. You know, again, it would require additional stakeholders and partners, maybe a local land trust or parks, or a larger involvement from the DNR. But it certainly is a unique feature and merits a larger expression on the landscape. Coincidentally, 20 miles to the west in Illinois, there's the Doris Westfall Prairie, which is about a 60-acre restoration. So this little feature here has been in place for about 30 years. It does have a conservation easement on it, so it will be protected. But without additional assistance or efforts, it will just be 30 or 3 acres in 30 more years. In 2019, Mark Kenyon, a contributor to the Meteor Network, took on a project to develop an ag parcel to optimize it for hunting. And they also wanted to look at other conservation values. So they had several folks with different skills come and look at the property. When I walked the site with Mark, I immediately noticed a little hill prairie remnant down in this area of about 3.5 acres. And it was very unique in that it had a really decent little suite of prairie species, but was encroached by brush. I talked to him about what could be done with prescribed fire there to enhance it and to possibly utilize it as a seed source for some of his expanded pollinator habitat opportunities. We did burn the site. It did respond very positively with renewed vigor in the prairie. And coincidentally, Mark subsequently harvested his first big whitetail off the property from a stand within this feature. The meat eaters have subsequently deeded the property over to the American Deer Association, or the National Deer Association rather, and they're continuing the management of the property with conservation and hunting values. They do have a much larger pollinator planting at the site now. They did not utilize this feature as a seed source, however, but it's still would be a big win for pollinator habitat. So kind of a neat property there, a neat project, and it was very interesting to work with hunters and expand the value of this property beyond just hunting, but for all wildlife. So with that, that's all I have for today. I hope some of these ideas and strategies and examples have stimulated some thoughts in your mind for your projects. And I appreciate your time and look forward to responding to any questions you have in the Q&A session of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And with that, we would like to invite all of you to enter your questions into the Q&A function box. Okay. So our first question is, can you speak to swamping of species in high quality sensitive areas from using non-local seed sources?
Please read that again.
Sure. Can you speak to swamping of species? Okay, so I believe the question would be, can you speak to the actions of genetically swamping species in high quality or sensitive areas from using non-local seed sources?
Yeah, I guess there is some interaction considerations there, and it depends on your specific objectives. If you have a remnant, I would certainly prefer to expand on that element by using the seed that's available from that, from a purist standpoint. But also, if you're have a larger area and you're going to expand with non-native genotype or maybe native plants, but from not a local source, there's certainly an opportunity for gene flow in that scenario, and you know, there's not a lot of maybe specific studies there, but you could assume that if the local species have some adaptation to the soils or climate of that local area, that those expressions would persist into the future and likely dominate what's brought in. A concern would be like if with warm season grasses, sometimes there's a tendency for some of these maybe more aggressive selections to creep into the mixes from forage development. And so you certainly want to be aware of that and not end up with a planting that's run over with some forage switchgrass or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of concerns about that, a lot of nuance, and probably not a firm answer. It does depend on your objectives. As long as you're thoughtful about it, I'm pretty sure you're going to come out with a positive project in terms of helping pollinators.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. The next question from Connie asks, if you can't burn or use prescribed fire, can you speak to using a mowing regime instead?
Yeah, certainly historically there was a real dynamic disturbance regime for grasslands, including large herbivores and fire. In contemporary times, the thing that's missing in these features is fire. It's important to deploy it thoughtfully and strategically. There are places where it's not possible, and mowing is your option, but mowing is always a distant second. You just don't get the effects that you do with fire with any other management techniques. And some of that is, is something you need to consider on the front end of a planting. Even if your landowner is lukewarm about eventually or ever using prescribed fire to plan for the eventual use of it, I think is a real good strategy. We see a lot of acres of, for instance, CRP going in where the intent is to have diverse plantings and they never get burned. And so we have a long history of these sites, becoming less and less important in terms of pollinator habitat. They just become very grassy and thatch filled. And you can do some mowing, and they have some recommendations for mid-contract management, including light tillage and then supplemental seeding. I'm not a huge fan of that for the specific reason that there's a lot with the interest in pollinators. There's a lot of demand for native seed. So it doesn't make sense to me to suggest that areas that have already been planted be disturbed and be a drain on that seed source where there's so much demand otherwise for the lack of actually deploying proper management, which I maintain would be periodic prescribed fire. I think you're muted, Elizabeth.
Apologize. Yes, I was stuck on mute there. Thank you. That was an excellent answer. Thank you. The next question asks if you have experience using hemiparasites to reduce grass dominance and to promote forb abundance.
Not specifically. I've been doing some research on that, reading up on it. I do have some seed sources for the hemiparasites, and I've got a few projects that I want to plant those species into. And I understand there's, there's observations that indicate a benefit, but they're not, it seems like the research indicates there's not a lot of specifics about exactly the mechanisms that are occurring in the rhizosphere. So I expect that there's going to be more research and more recommendations coming out of that. But that is certainly one of the examples of the emerging science with management of native pollinator habitats.
Thank you. And the next question asks, what do you think is the biggest mistake beginners make when working on restoration?
Oh, biggest mistake beginners make. There's a lot made of site preparation early on. And I'm a big fan of understanding what a given site's challenges are, but doing as little site prep in terms of soil tillage, and I'm not a fan of multiple applications of herbicide to control the existing vegetation. And I'm not a fan at all of products like Plateau that are sprayed after the planting is in place and allow for the and allow some species that are plateau tolerant to persist. What you end up with is a real thin species profile out there after the fact. So I look at multiple tillages and multiple spray applications as robbing cost or robbing dollars that could otherwise be spent on more conservative seed mixes. You certainly want to disturb the soil as little as possible. The more you turn over the soil, the more weed seed you tend to get. I find that if you plant later in the season outside the conventional planting window, and I'm talking the 1st of June through maybe even the end of July, you tend to get less weed pressure or grassy weeds that really don't compete with the establishing native species. And so those are the kinds of things that I think about and kind of wince when I hear recommendations for real heavy-handed and extensive site preparation ahead of time. Really, even if you get some weed pressure, if you're going to get prescribed fire on the ground specifically, you know, at most you can really get by with just a couple cycles of mowing during those establishment periods to help keep enough sunlight down to the ground level for those native seeds to establish and develop their root structure.
Fantastic, thank you. Lisa asks, are you starting to shift species mixes to include more species at the northern edge of their ranges that might benefit from climate shifts?
Not yet. There's a lot of discussion about that. Even with species like Carner Blue, I was at a GLRI meeting where they were modeling that the Carner Blue's core range is going to be north of Lake Superior at some time in the future, and with a little butterfly that only flies, you know, a couple hundred meters in its lifetime, it's going to be kind of a trick for them to get across the Great Lakes. But with plants, many of our grassland species have pretty wide range north and south. And so I think there's quite a bit of plasticity in their capacity to grow. But if you're, let's see, at the northern edge of some of these species ranges, you're obviously going to have an opportunity to grow them further north successfully. And likewise, if you're at the southern edge, you know, they're going to be not as successful in this area out into the future. So, but it's going to be a real big species by species situation. And, you know, I guess probably one of the better strategies is to provide mixes with a lot of diversity and let the plants sort it out in the field.
Excellent, thank you. There's a question here. There are a couple questions about earlier management and asking if you can speak to management in the first 3 years, saying that they understand that it depends on and will be situational, but are there any sort of canned management schedules and corresponding management actions for prairie management within the first 3 years?
Yeah, this calls back to my establishment preferences. I would avoid over-the-top herbicides or broadcast herbicides after the planting. Even things that say they're, you know, herbicide tolerant. You're going to thin out your species expression. Certainly there's maybe situations where you're going to need to do a spot spray if there's some particularly aggressive situation, but I've never even had species like Canada thistle persist in a decent prairie planting that's managed by fire. I mean, they just can't even compete. So a lot of it is get good soil, get good seed, get good soil contact, put it in the ground, come back in 3 years and enjoy. I think we spend a lot of time, aggravating, cogitating about, the first years of establishment, and those plants are well versed at sitting there, putting a lot of energy into their root structure, and then, getting ready to put in flowers and more biomass in years, 3 to 5. So patience is a big message if you're getting into this, and that's a continuing mantra that you have to share with people that are new to this, and that's really difficult in our culture that's geared towards instant gratification. Maybe we'll get to the point where Amazon will roll out your Prairie and it'll be instantaneous, but we aren't there yet.
Very true, and good advice. Patience when establishing prairies. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dan. And with that, we will be moving on to our next presentation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. One moment, sorry. Okay. Okay. I'm now thrilled to introduce our next speakers, Dr. Joe Robb, who has been working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service since 1985. In 2000, he helped to establish the Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge and is currently the project leader for the Big Oaks and Muscatatuck National Wildlife Refuge Complex in southeastern Indiana. In addition to guiding activities on the complex, he coordinates with the Army and Air National Guard for the Department of Defense-owned property to provide long-term management on this biologically diverse 50,000-acre Big Oaks NWR, which is a globally important bird area. In addition, he oversees and manages approximately 9,000 acres a year with prescribed fire on the refuge. Recently, he has worked to restore about 30 miles of the refuge's perimeter roadsides with native plants for pollinators. They are now exploring management alternatives on how to maintain those restorations. Quanit Ali is a wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and currently stationed at the Necedah National Wildlife Refuge in Wisconsin. Quanit first became involved with the service at the Glacial Ridge National Wildlife Refuge in northern Minnesota, and then worked with Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge as the Resource Assistant Fellow. The focus of his time at Big Oaks was a project studying the effects of different habitat management disturbances on pollinator habitat located near roadsides and right-of-way margins. Angela VanWinden serves as a wildlife refuge specialist at the Muscatatuck National Wildlife Refuge in Indiana. Her work with pollinators includes working a fellowship at the Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge. She studied the efficacy of planting plugs as a method of introducing new individuals to pollinator plots and assessed the condition of plots 1 year after establishment. She's also studied plant-pollinator interactions in the Sierra Nevada mountains and has conducted research tracking floral blooms and causes of phenological differences, as well as utilizing citizen scientists as contributors to research projects. Please welcome Joe Robb, Quanit Ali, and Angela VanWinden.
Hi, I'm Joe Robb, and we are glad to discuss management of pollinator habitat. Usually restoration of habitat is the main focus of these type of talks. But if you manage these types of habitats, you know that keeping these areas productive and free of invasives can be challenging. The maintenance of them is the main challenge. Pollinator habitat are those areas that provide food, shelter, and resources needed for those species that we consider important for pollination: insects, arthropods, and even birds and mammals. This provides the needed plant communities, food resources, dead vegetation, litter, logs, anything that pollinators need for their life cycle and for reproduction and overwintering. Our talk will mostly be on the disturbance needed for setting back succession that tends to increase productivity for meadows, grasslands, and forest understory plants. Disturbance regimes, in the past, natural or human-made, were the sources for these successional setbacks. Tornadoes, hurricanes, other types of windstorms, droughts, floods, large bison herds, other herbivores grazing, wildfires, and human-ignited fires were all common causes of disturbance. In the past, slash burn or swidden agriculture was very important and produces open pollinator areas as areas are abandoned. Usually a patch is disturbed in the matrix of a larger landscape. Areas of disturbance can be randomly placed across the landscape, or features caused by soil or hydrology or topography sometimes influence these areas where disturbances take place, and those areas were important for habitats and productive areas for pollinators. Typically, these disturbances prevent common species from dominating and increases diversity. This is an example of a natural disturbance that still occurs. This tornado that passed through my refuge, Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge, and disturbed an area about a quarter mile wide and about 3 miles long. The early land surveyor notes from the General Land Office indicated dozens of former tornado tracks and blowdowns throughout Indiana in the 1800s. These areas cleared of canopy and increased forbs and other pollinator plants in the tornado's path. Other disturbances such as bison migration and grazing no longer occur across most of the landscape. These areas form something similar to a shelter wood cut. That's a type of timber harvest method, where widely spaced trees are left following a cut that often leads to uneven age stands and forest stands, and an increase in herbaceous layers and flowers. Basically simulates what happens in this tornado's path. This is where the tornado went through, and it allowed a lot of scattered openings that increased the herbaceous layer underneath the forest. Periodic fire through a forest can also simulate a loss of canopy as well. I love this cartoon, but it's the sad truth that we all face. We have limited areas that we can manage, and that limits pollinator habitat since we have other things that we also try to manage. And my refuge is a fenced area, about 50,000 acres, surrounded by mostly non-pollinator habitat, a lot of intensively managed ag. This decreases the creation of habitat caused by natural disturbances, and humans actively try to reduce disturbances. For example, we try to prevent wildfires. Disturbance techniques change with the scale of the area that you're working with. Hand pulling and weeding and planting would work on the scale of this backyard pollinator habitat, but not for the 50,000 acre refuge that I manage. Some techniques are also limited to the site. We have bombs since we are a former Army proving ground. Other areas have limits due to endangered species requirements or local ordinances. For example, we are also prevented from burning during much of the growing season due to listed bat species on the endangered species list. If you observe pollinator habitat over time, you will notice that changes occur annually. What was common initially changes through time. The species change in their dominance and things appear that weren't there from the initial planting. Milkweed, for example, is a species that benefits from disturbance. Fire, light disking, or grazing, anything that keeps other species at bay and leaves open space for common milkweed rhizomes to spread into open areas. If you can see this area now, it has very few milkweed stems, so we plan to disturb this plot next spring by burning it. Scale is important to consider. Larger landscapes have more natural variation and usually more diversity in plant and pollinator species. Also, you need to think about landscapes and other habitat variables for those pollinator needs. Lots of bees, bumblebees, beetles, and butterflies need both open meadows and grasslands and forest edges and woodlands for their habitat needs. So managers need to think about how disturbance regimes will affect associated areas within the treatment site. We have dabbled with different techniques in our work to bring about disturbance. Prescribed fire, mechanical grinding of woody vegetation, disking, herbicide application, aerial spraying should be thought as different tools in an integrated management setting and planned accordingly. Changing tools typically is beneficial for different results in problem issues. This is me several years ago in an area that we aerially sprayed to remove woody invasives. You can see the dead black locust, which is not native in the area in the background. This area was subsequently burned, and it contains several rare species now, including Maryland meadow beauty and several species of milkweed and blazing star. So I consider it a success because these species blossomed, and we increased rare plants and benefits to pollinators. Now I will hand this next part of the talk over to Angela.
Hi, I'm Angela VanWinden. I'm the Wildlife Refuge Specialist at Muscatatuck National Wildlife Refuge, and I'm going to continue talking about management of pollinator habitat. Patch burn grazing is a management technique that promotes floral diversity and habitat heterogeneity. Ungulates will graze preferentially on the freshly burned habitat within your unit, and within that freshly burned area will graze preferentially on grasses over forbs. As grasses are usually the most dominant in regrowth, they're the first to kind of sprout up. After a disturbance such as fire, this suppression by the ungulates really helps promote good floral diversity, providing those nectar resources for pollinators. This works really only under a light stalking rate. If the stalking rate is too high, then you'll get grazing on forbs in the freshly burned habitat, and the ungulates will start to graze outside of that most recently burned area as well. You'll get grazing on those longer growths. So the light stalking rate is key for this to work.
For the rest of this talk, we are going to focus on prescribed fire for managing pollinator habitat. Ecosystems are adapted to specific fire intervals, and many times with prescribed fire, we try and replicate these historical timings. The larger the interval, the more fuel accumulated, which led to hotter fires. Ecosystems were adapted to these infrequent but intense fires. With climate change, these intervals are changing and we are seeing more frequent fires. This needs to be monitored to see how the changing fire intervals are influencing communities.
What are the benefits of fire? Fire can release nutrients in the soil. It burns up the thatch and litter. It opens up the bare ground. Some species have seeds that even require germination by fire. So a fire can increase your diversity in that way, introducing new growth that hasn't been seen since your last fire. The fire can also reduce the woody stems in a habitat that normally would outcompete the forbs. All of this opens up space for herbaceous cover, increasing the diversity of forbs for better pollinator habitat. There's sometimes concerns about fire being harmful for rare species, but the benefits of fire as a disturbance apply to rare plants as well, such as this narrowleaf sunflower. It responds really well to fire in Indiana. Fire will create openings in a forest. Removal of the overstory trees will transform the woodland into a savanna. These new openings are spaces that are great for woodland floral resources like this stand of black cohosh growing between these trees here in this photo.
The abundance and diversity of pollinators is generally positively associated to the amount of early successional habitat, but early ephemeral flowers in spring and forested areas are also important to pollinators, as well as areas with canopy openings. You can see the fire scars on the trees in this canopy opening. These areas burned and opened up space for good herbaceous cover, providing floral resources to pollinators.
It's best management practices to create feathered edges when creating or maintaining habitat units. The feathered edges are gradual transitions from one habitat type to the next, so you're not going directly from prairie to mature forest. You have this middle ground that has maybe some shrubs, some thicker growth, some dead trees, and this provides good habitat and shelter for a wide variety of wildlife. Dead trees are used for nesting and wintering by many pollinator species and endangered species too. Tree mortality is influenced by a lot of factors such as timing, species, size of tree, location, and fire parameters. If there's active growth occurring, you're more likely to induce mortality during a burn for trees than if you burned when the trees were dormant. Larger trees and trees with thicker bark are also going to be less likely to die during a prescribed burn. There's just less of an impact on those tissues if they're larger or have thicker bark. The temperature of the burn is also very important. If you have a very, very hot fire, you're more likely to cause damage to those inner tissues, causing mortality. Although if you do have a low temperature fire, but it's exposed to the tree for a longer period of time, you will also induce mortality. This photo is of a tagged tree at Big Oaks. These trees were followed after burns to estimate tree mortality. And we found that in our area, a late growing season fire caused about a 5% increase in mortality over a spring burn for trees. Invasive species are usually a cause for concern for many project managers, but fire is not a cure-all tool for invasive species management. Many species even respond positively to fire, so multiple management techniques will be necessary to control a lot of invasives. For example, autumn olive responds really well to fire. The Michigan DNR found that in areas that are well adapted to fire, a prescribed fire followed by chemical treatment can help control autumn olive, or other management techniques altogether. They also found goats work particularly well. Multiple years of goat grazing on autumn olive can help control it. So you might need to get a little bit more creative than prescribed fire for controlling invasive species, but it is one of your many management tools. There are negative effects of prescribed fire, both directly and indirectly. Many pollinator species have immature life stages that are immobile and therefore unable to escape an incoming flame. For example, the regal fritillary, the females lay eggs haphazardly in the late summer. A burn in areas where the fritillaries are is going to cause mortality to these butterflies. A fire can also destroy the nesting site of pollinators. Many species of bees will nest in litter and stems. Litter and stems are the fuel for the fire, and the nesting pollinators will be burned up right along with those leaves that litter the stems. There is some evidence to say that the ground nesting bees are protected from fire, insulated by the soil, but that's still some ongoing research. The fire also removes floral resources, which has an indirect negative effect on the nearby pollinator community. A burn in that area removes those vital resources for pollinators, so there's less to go around.
Because of the negative impacts of fire on pollinators, the Xerces Society recommends burning no more than 30% of a single unit in a year. Repeated treatment should be no more often than every 3 to 10 years. These guidelines allow for refugia for the pollinators in your burn area and will allow for recolonization to that burned area. Many pollinators have short flight distances, so that unburned 60% of your unit is where the mobile pollinators can go to escape the flaming front, reducing those direct mortality impacts. And once the burned area starts to have growth again, there will be pollinators close by to utilize that habitat. The Xerces Society also recommends low-intensity fires from late fall to early spring. These parameters shouldn't be changed unless necessary for the objectives of your project, such as trying to kill trees. You're going to need a more intense fire. However, one area under study is large landscapes with more frequent fires result in less intense fires naturally, with more skips that provide for the refugia needed, allowing for these bigger burns. The areas within your burned habitat are providing a place for escape and where recolonization will start from. This has been observed at Big Oaks. Now I'm going to hand it over to Quanit.
Hello everyone, my name is Quanit Ali, wildlife biologist at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge. At this point, I'd like to introduce everyone to the procedural aspects of conducting a prescribed burn to hopefully build a base for understanding the proper implementation. Like any other management tool, prescribed fire requires a detailed plan which outlines the who, what, when, where, how. With fire, there are also additional considerations such as safety, contingencies for emergencies, strategies to be used for conducting the burn, and prescription metrics which help match a burn day with fire for the desired outcome while still being within safe burning conditions. The prescription is comprised of a variety of metrics, chief among them being wind direction, relative humidity, timing of day, fuel moisture, and temperature. A big reason why prescribed burns can be conducted safely is because of the crew qualifications. It's always important to make sure when conducting prescribed burns that the appropriate amount of experience is represented amongst the leadership for the burn, matching the required complexity. A great starting point for private landowners to get involved with applying fire to their landscapes is your state prescribed fire council. If you're interested, that's one of the first places I would recommend that private landowners look to see if there's any options for conducting prescribed fire on private land. One of the first steps to planning a prescribed fire is going to be to look at your landscape from the perspective of its interaction with fire. And typically there are fuel models that'll help you predict certain fire behavior based off of what vegetation communities are present. But you or I can also have a general understanding of what fire behavior may be expected by evaluating the fuel density and cover. Light fuels are typically going to burn quicker and flashier, while your heavies are going to generate heat pretty intensely but may build more slowly. And that fuel spread, that patchiness or homogeneity, is definitely also going to impact the rate of spread for the fire and its ability to build heat while moving. Fuel loading is also one of those important things that we're looking at when we need to determine where we are when we're considered in prescription. If something is really heavily loaded with fine fuels, we may need to consider a day with a not so crazy relative humidity in order to help accomplish our objectives while staying safe. So we've mentioned the word prescription a couple times now, and we've kind of gone over the basic concept of what it is. But prescription dialing is basically this process where we go through and we figure out how each of these variables influence the fire's behavior and where we're willing to allow ourselves to have some play. Examples of this could be saying that we're going to allow relative humidities to be quite low when we conduct our prescribed burns, something that's closer to the low 20s, and that we're willing to have a little bit higher winds. Basically, what you're trying to do is match these variables that impact fire behavior to safe burning conditions in order to also accomplish our objectives. As we've also previously talked about fuel types, we've also got to have some consideration for what those conditions are going to be when we eventually do the burn. One important consideration is where we rate on the fire danger scale. Oftentimes the fire danger scale is created by a combination of environmental variables collected by remote automatic weather stations or different gauge stations locally sourced, and understanding where you sit as far as your local climate will allow you to help kind of also play into that prediction of how your fuels are going to behave and give you a better guess of what may happen when you choose to drop the match. So seasonality is also a pretty big predictor of fire behavior and an important part of prescription dialing. As you guys can imagine, when there's snow on the ground and your landscape is full frosted, you maybe aren't going to have the best odds of conducting a prescribed burn. But depending on what your goals are for that landscape, a spring burn may do awesome things for improving your forb and grass diversity, while a late growing season burn may help reduce woody stems and resprouts for the following growing season. What we're looking here with seasonality is trying to be mobile and flexible with pairing the time of year, which impacts the burn outcomes, with when we actually conduct the burn. Sometimes seasonality also influences when you physically can burn, right? Here at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge, when we have whooping cranes, which are an endangered species, nesting on site, we no longer have the ability to go in and really burn in that unit due to considerations for protecting that species. There's also times in the year where wildfire danger is so crazy ripping high that it's just not safe to put matches on the ground, whether or not you've got control line and crew on standby to respond to anything that may happen just due to the environmental conditions at hand. One component of ensuring safety when conducting a prescribed burn is monitoring the edges of the prescribed fire. Ways that we can secure those edges and ensure that fire does not jump outside of the bounds of areas that we've designated to be burned is by using fire breaks, which can be anything as small as wet line, which is laid down by spraying down the edge of the burned area with water, to as large as what we can see in this photo here, such as a paved road. Oftentimes, this will also be coupled with site prep in order to ensure that those fire breaks and edges are safe and secure from any aerial hazards, such as dead trees, which may set on fire and then throw embers onto the other side of the line, or even leaves that simply need to be blown off of a mowed break or trail. Wind direction and smoke are also key to help us direct the direction of the fire and where that smoke is going to be laying down. In this photo here, you can see that one of the main reasons why this burn was able to be conducted safely was because of the fact that the wind direction was played to keep the smoke off of the road, ensuring that there would be as minimal of a hazard to road traffic as possible. While a lot of the fire break, site prep, wind direction, and smoke management has been thought out prior to conducting the prescribed burn, we can sometimes also see that within our burns, we experience variability in the fire behavior. This variability can sometimes drive us to alter or adjust our strategies in order to ensure that we can complete the burn safely. Here we can see what was a control line being augmented by foam added over the top of it in order to ensure that the fire did not back over it and pose any threat to the grass behind the firefighter observed in the foreground of this photo. When you're conducting a prescribed burn, you're probably going to see these main three types of flaming fronts: backing, flanking, and heading. Backing flames are lit at the base of the burn unit, opposing the prevailing wind direction. This ensures that the resulting flame fronts burn at a low intensity with low rates of spread as it consumes backwards into the wind. Often, you're going to use a control line to ensure that the flames don't head fire into the direction of the wind. Flanking fires are going to be your strips that are lit into the direction of the wind and fan outwards left and right, and are used to build out the burned area on the edges of a prescribed burn. These flames are going to move slower than a head fire, but faster than a backing fire. Head fire flames are lit perpendicular to the prevailing wind and run with the direction of the wind. These flame fronts generally generate the most amount of thermal intensity as well as the largest flame size. And then there's going to be also some techniques that are especially useful for tasks such as interior ignitions. The primary techniques that we use are strips and dots. Dots are essentially just a spot of fire laid down on the ground and allowed to spread at a low and slow, even pace. Strips can be long stretches of fire lit interior and are used to improve the total burned area if it's questionable that the head fire is going to be able to burn through everything, or even to just expedite the ignitions of the burn. Whichever strategy you choose to use is going to come down to the objectives you have for the fire on the ground. If one of your goals is to reduce woody stems, you may want to use strips and head fire to build intense flame heat. But if your goal is to protect trees and understory burn, your interior igniters may drop dots next to trees in order to kind of slowly consume around them, consume the fuels, and protect them from the incoming heat by removing all of the understory layers such as the thatch or the duff. In the end, the most appropriate plan may also be the one that's limited by a variety of environmental and logistic variables, but a simple ignitions plan executed well will always be better than a complex one executed poorly. So I hinted at this previously, and now that we've set the stage for some of what's considered while doing a prescribed burn, we'll jump into a little bit of how it's actually done. And as I mentioned a minute ago, the catcher's mitt or the box is basically building a perimeter of unburned fuels that when a head fire is ignited allows for the flames to stay within the safe bounds inside of an unburned area to reduce risks of spotting or slop over. So as we talked about earlier, backfire is that perpendicular fire that's running into the wind. So it's going against the wind and moving pretty slowly. In the context of the catcher's mitt, this is typically going to be your base or your bottom from which you'll build your flanks. It's typically where you're trying to build the most amount of secure black, as this is where the direction of the head fire will be running into eventually when you reach that point in your burn. And as it sounds like the flanks are the sides, it's where you're bringing fire into the wind, but along the side of your burn unit, helping to close off that square and provide some edges to your catcher's mitt. Now, if you can imagine this unburned perimeter as somewhat of a U shape within, say, a square plot of land, you now have this top that must be lit off, and at this point, that's where you're looking to do your head fire depending on your ignition techniques. You could be dropping strips or dots, or you could just have somebody go from end to end and carrying a drip torch and start lighting off fuel. And after that head fire is lit, it's likely going to continue to consume as much as it's able to, hopefully within that catcher's mitt down to the bottom where you've backfired and had your line set. After that, you're left with mop-up. Mop-up is the procedure where you're now going in and making sure that your edges are secure so that when you walk away from the fire, you know that it's not at risk of starting a new one. So I've probably gone through a whirlwind explanation of what prescribed fire is, and I hope I was able to provide some sort of a context for how they're conducted and planned. But I would just like to leave the audience with this. It took a very short time for the environment to be changed. The ecosystems, ecological communities, and vegetation communities are going to take a lot of time to recover from what they were, and we need to have appropriate expectations for that. So one prescribed fern may not be the one that changes your landscape back to what your desired condition is, but it's an important tool to be including in your arsenal when thinking about integrating your disturbances with your land management. Some problems may always persist, but we can always have realistic goals about how we want to use fire moving forward, and I think that's the important thing, is to scale it towards your objectives, and hopefully those are in line with what your management capabilities are. And with that, thank you.
Very good, Quanit. Unfortunately, especially with invasives, impacts, or plans, we found that from when we started, Microstesium, which is a Japanese tiltgrass, thrives in disturbance, including fire. So we've had to alter our burn regimes to try to exclude these areas. There are site differences, so there's benefit in learning what works in your management sites. So using some of the techniques we discussed, you can find out whether you're reaching your objectives by monitoring. The next talk in this series will discuss monitoring and learning in detail. We're happy to answer any of your questions at this time.
Fantastic. Thank you for those wonderful presentations. And with that, we'd like to invite our presenters to turn on their cameras and mics, and to invite all our participants to enter your questions into the Q&A function box. And with that, the first question is, what do you see as the major barriers to getting prescribed fire implemented?
I think it's oftentimes logistic barriers, right? So coordinating individuals with the appropriate amount of experience, and then being able to fund that experience to come to your area and apply fire to the landscape. There's sometimes also concerns for safety. Neighboring landowners are also a consideration, depending on how your land is situated. You may be blocked in on a square block, 4 sides, with private landowners on all areas, which requires that, you know, one of them is going to get smoked out, or going to have some potentially deleterious effects from you doing your fire. So I think ways that you can overcome that are oftentimes going to be consulting somebody with a lot of experience with putting fire on the landscape, and having them work with you to solve some of those problems.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is in statement says, we have some enthusiasm for summer burns in some parts of southern Illinois. Some say it's better for forbs, others say it's terrible for wildlife. What is the best way to burn to boost forbs and to reduce grasses?
Growing season burns that we've done, it does increase forbs. Sometimes in our area, it almost reduces the grasses too much. So you have to be very site specific. Summer burns move very slow in our case, and so wildlife results, I mean, this is usually after bird nesting. Wildlife can move out of these areas pretty quickly because the fire is moving so slow. It's very smoky growing season burns in case there's a major drought, and then you're in other issues. Where a lot of folks, like in Southern Illinois, if you have a lot of heavy warm season grass, the idea is to use those growing season burns to reduce the grass and open up areas for forbs, and that does work in some of those locations.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question from Eric asks, for restorations in city areas, do you recommend ways to pursue park managers and staff to use fire instead of mowing management?
City areas, you have a lot of smoke considerations. That some of those pictures in Quanit's talk was a county park that we did Partners for Wildlife, and you saw the road and the traffic on the road. There's all kinds of smoke, safety issues that you have to deal with. And so some of these areas, when you're surrounded by housing and folks who don't understand, there's a real public outreach component of it. And it is possible. There were some burns that we did at Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge where we had these high dollar homes right around the parcel that we were burning. And we were able to work with them and work with the weather conditions, with the wind direction and everything to get that accomplished. But the more folks you have around your parcel, the more facilities, more infrastructure, the more difficulty it is, especially like power lines. Smoke on power lines can cause issues with arcing and everything. So you have to watch that as well.
Thank you. Brooke asks, can you speak to the timing of seeding related to prescribed fire? If seed is put down in the fall or in a frost seeding to allow for stratification, will a spring controlled burn in that area consume the seed?
Typically, yeah. You heard the last speaker talk about mowing being very important after the initial seeding and to remove weeds. A lot of times prescribed fire would be used before a seeding and not after the seeding. So you would burn the site and prep the site and get rid of the thatch and overstory to open up bare ground to seed after the fire. Sometimes after the seed is established, though, in a couple years, then the burning, you can burn almost annually after the seed is established, and that helps reduce competition.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is for Quanit. Quanit, how often do you have a secondary burn unit ready to go when weather prevents firing your first choice burn unit?
I can speak to how it's done at Necedah and how the fire staff here chooses how to structure that. And basically, what it is looking at our management units and where they are in their rotation for having fire applied, or the burn rotation, so to speak. We just kind of have units that are good to go, and based off of the wind, choose the one that's doable for the day. So I would say you're choosing from a pot that's got all of your units on there and going just based off of what you can pull off for the day. So I guess everything, there's always a secondary, if that answers the question. There's always a secondary unit there, and a tertiary, and a 4, 5, 6 down the road.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. So we invite our participants to enter more questions if you have some. The next question asks can you speak more on how to plan for rotational burn planning using the 30% rule?
Well, it all depends on your site. We have large landscapes. We burn 9,000 to 10,000 acres a year. And so we can use rotations and alternate sites that have that 30% area across the other burn unit. A lot of folks will divide their unit up using fire breaks interiorly to protect areas from being burned during that burn. So they in their plan, they develop refuge in the burn plan, so areas of the site won't be affected by fire. One thing that we have found here is that when you increase decrease the intervals, where it's just every couple years, that because of the low fuel levels, lots of areas within the burn unit won't burn, and so you have refuge right out in the unit. And so sometimes decreasing the interval, depending on your site, can do the same thing as putting fire breaks within the unit.
Excellent, thank you. And Connie asks, can you speak to the effect of woods nearby, for example, eddy effects?
Yeah, I guess depending on the wind and how the woods come out into the unit, you can definitely experience a lot of shifting fire behavior. The eddies will definitely come around and swirl the flames, and you may even see fire whirls or other such kind of unique fire behavior. As far as concerns for that, I would say that's primarily going to be when you're doing your ignitions. You might be concerned about, if you're coming around a wooded corner, how the wind is going to spin that fire, and then if it is going to spin that fire, where it's going to go. So just acknowledging that that's going to happen, and how do you account for some of that by maybe having other people watching behind you to make sure that it doesn't jump over a fire break. Those sorts of considerations are definitely made around very heterogeneous fire lines.
Okay, thank you. And for our last question, I'm going to combine a couple. How often do burns need to be done, and what are the primary environmental cues to know that you need to conduct prescribed fire?
That comes from the monitoring and what your goals and objectives are for the fire. And these open grassland communities where you're getting lots of woody intrusion, or you have problems with invasives and you have to try to knock those back, a lot of times you increase your frequency. As I said, sometimes we are burning like at a two-year window. Wooded communities and forested communities are a lot longer. I mean, it depends on what you're trying to do in those sites. Some of those sites, like that Black Cohosh site, it's more woodland savanna, and it could take a longer window, and it still does a pretty good job in those communities. We have several rare species that we work with the heritage folks within our state to work on trying to keep those rare plants, and they encourage us to burn in those areas at certain intervals. And so we kind of go with the folks who know the species that we're dealing with and take their recommendations. It's not a one rule that fits all for all your sites, and you really have to look at your location and what your objective is, and monitor and see what works.
Excellent answer. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Jennifer Thing. Jennifer coordinates the Monarch Joint Ventures Science Program. This includes research such as how site preparation and management affect habitat characteristics, or what the timing or distribution of monarch reproduction is on conserved lands. She helps coordinate the integrated monarch monitoring program and shares scientific findings with MJV's partners. Jennifer received her undergraduate degree in environmental science from Carroll College in Wisconsin, and her master's of science in fisheries and wildlife biology from the Ohio State University. Prior to joining MJV, Jennifer worked on several grassland bird and vegetation research projects, as well as for several conservation organizations working to protect water quality and wildlife habitat in the Midwest. With that, please welcome Jennifer Thing.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction, and a huge thank you to Pollinator Partnership for bringing us here for these workshop series. I'm glad to round things out here at workshop 5, bottom of the hour here. and really want to talk to you about monitoring on your projects and your restoration projects. So hopefully you're able to take everything that you've learned from the series, apply that on your conservation sites, and then really what you might want to know next is how is that impacting your site? How can we track this? How do we know that something is working? So I'm going to talk to you about the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program. There are a couple of reasons why you might monitor. I mentioned a few just now. You might also have requirements. You might have obligations to track pre and post management interactions or metrics, report that to a funder, or maybe you're working with a certain conservation plan, and that plan might have requirements for you to track some habitat quality metric or track monarch activity or some other metric and report back to that conservation plan. You might also want to track for your own knowledge, your immediate outcomes. So say, did native plant species richness increase after you had a prescribed fire last fall? Or how many species from your seed mix are flowering the next year or 2 years later after seeding? You might also be interested in long-term outcomes. So maybe you monitor every couple years so that you can track if your native plant frequency is changing, or are we reducing our shrub cover? Are we finding lower and lower percentage of shrub cover over time given our management activities? You can also use monitoring for adaptive management. So both your long and your short-term outcomes feed into adaptive management. You might find that a certain plant species that you're seeding never actually grows from seed when you plant it in the spring. So you need to be able to track that information to have that answer, that result, and maybe change how you're managing or how you're initiating restoration. You might also be interested in long-term trends. And this also speaks to the broader mission of the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program. Here's an example in this graph of the power of long-term monitoring. So this is a graph of the percent of starting milkweed density on certain sites. And so one of these lines, the solid line towards the top, is based on data from a community science program called the Monarch Larvae Monitoring Project, where community scientists not only monitor monarchs on their milkweed, but they also had been quantifying for decades the amount of milkweed on their site. And so these researchers, Pleasance and Oberhauser, published some research in 2013 using that data, as well as some data from long-term monitoring of milkweed stems in agricultural field, to estimate that there's been about a 60% decline in milkweed in the Midwest from 1999 to 2010. They linked that to the increased use of herbicides and herbicide-tolerant crops. So that's one impact that we can have by monitoring over the long term. So what's a monitoring program that allows uniform data to be collected across these large spatial scales and long periods of time, but it can be used by community scientists, it can be used by conservation professionals, something that can be used by researchers. It can track your management so that you can adapt your management strategy. And it can fit into a variety of site sizes. I've got a pretty small site, I've got a pretty large site, I've got a long, skinny site. How can we use a program or a unified monitoring program to get information across all of these sites? Well, the answer was on the first slide. Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program can address all of these needs. The goals of the monitoring program are broadly to monitor monarchs. So this was designed to monitor trends in monarch populations and reproduction across the breeding range. That focus might seem narrow. Maybe you're not really interested in monarchs, but it could work for you for a couple reasons. Maybe you have a funding source that's monarch specific. So recording and reporting monarch metrics is important to that funding source. Or you might be using monarchs as an indicator species. Maybe you have a board member or a donor that has a real strong interest in monarchs. And so by reporting annually on the monarch use on your site, you're making an impact to those individuals. Or you might look for a charismatic species that can attract volunteers to do some monitoring for you. The IMMP also has a goal of evaluating pollinator habitat, and this speaks to more than just monarchs. You can use this information to gauge how well your site is supporting pollinators or could support pollinators. There's two pieces to this habitat survey, quantifying milkweed and quantifying blooming nectar plants. You can also create a comprehensive list of blooming plants that are on site and compare that with your seeding list or your habitat objectives. And the IMMP also collects information on habitat management practices. So you can run your own experiments right within the IMMP. You could monitor 2 plots with different seed mixes or different site preps. I'd say we often just walk through a site and say that we feel like it's doing well, or we feel we know what worked and what didn't. But is that just because the site you walked through it that day had a lot of flowers blooming that day, or how's your memory holding up from year to year? Can you recall, say, if the species of plant, if butterfly weed readily established after seeding, or did it take a couple years? Did it do well on that really sandy site? Did it do it a little worse on the one that was a little wetter? How do we know this? What happens when maybe you leave that preserve or you leave your position? All that information in your head could leave with you. So the IMMP is potentially a way that we can inform conservation efforts and leave that trail, leave that information for whatever and whoever comes next. The IMMP can be applied on a variety of land uses. So if you're thinking, oh, well, I have this old ag field, it might not work well over there. There's actually certain ways we have in the protocol to address that type of land that might be an agricultural field or a really homogeneous uniform area. It works on preserved grasslands. There's a protocol for rights of way. So there's a lot of flexibility here. And that's a point I want you to take home with you from today. There's a lot of flexibility with the IMMP that comes across maybe as a lot of options. It might seem overwhelming, but what that means is that you can take the pieces that work for you, apply it on your property, and you don't have to worry about all those other options that might work well for someone else. The IMMP also applies to randomly selected and non-randomly selected sites. I won't get into details here, but just know that there is a part of the program aimed toward random sites to get an idea of what representative habitat is on the landscape. But in terms of conservation management, you're usually using non-random sites, these sites that you select you're working on, and you can apply the IMMP there. And it builds a nationwide data set that's shareable and can be used by researchers. So let's talk about your non-random site. So you've got an area that you're restoring. Let's say this here is your project area. This is your site. Where are you going to monitor? You're going to monitor a 1 hectare plot within your site. So first question might be, well, why not monitor the whole site? We actually tested the program back in 2017, the pilot year, with running transects and surveying across an entire site and distributing them very widely. Didn't work well. It was too difficult for volunteers. It required a lot of input from MJB's perspective because we had to put out or create these random points for volunteers and for conservation staff. So we streamlined it by surveying a 1 hectare plot within a conservation site. You can place this randomly within your site or put it in an area with representative habitat. It's up to you. And if your site's really large, you can put more than one plot down to monitor. We record some basic information about this plot, like the corners and the orientation that it's facing. And so basically we want to be able to find this plot if you're no longer there or if someone else is doing the survey. There are 4 optional activities within the IMMP. I'm going to address 3 of them here. The 4th one is rearing a monarch to assess its survival and parasitism, but that's the least frequently used activity, so I'm going to save us the time here and skip over that one. So the most commonly used activity is the milkweed and blooming plants survey. So the objectives, the broader IMMP objectives here are to document milkweed and nectar plant abundance by the land use sectors, so these different land use types that we talked about. We'd want to track regional changes in milkweed and nectar phenology over time. But you might have more specific or narrower objectives. You might be interested in your milkweed density or your seeding success or your proportion of native versus non-native blooming plants. So maybe you've got a site that's covered in Canada thistle. You've got a high proportion of non-native blooming plants. So what do you do with that information? Having a lot of nectar resource available, but maybe it's a less desirable plant. And a change, this just in for 2022, you can do either the milkweed counts or the blooming plants for your survey. So if you're not interested in counting milkweed stems, skip that, just look at blooming plants and vice versa. So what do you do when you're out there? You've got your plot. Here in this image is your 1 hectare plot. Within that plot, you're going to monitor 100 subplots. These are going to be along transects. Every 5 meters, you're going to lay down a little sampling frame and record some information. You're going to count milkweed stems. You're going to record blooming plants in a certain way. Typically takes 1 to 4 hours. When our field techs do it after they're trained up, it might take 1.5 hours to 2 hours. Coming from the background that you're coming from, you'll probably be on par with that, about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. Then these are where the transects go. So these are the transects you'll be following up one side, down the middle, and partially up the other side of your transect. Now let me point out, there are different shapes of plots that you can put in your conservation area. So if this particular 200 by 50 meter shape doesn't fit in your restoration site, you can refer to our protocol. There's guidelines, there's training videos online, there's MJV staff to talk you through it, but there are options to place different shapes and run your transects differently depending on your site shape. How often do you do this? As often as you'd like. Now, the protocol recommends a monthly survey for blooming plants and milkweed. That's not required. Data will be accepted at any frequency. So do this as often as works for you, whether you have a time constraint or you're more interested in a certain period of the breeding season. Do the surveys that work for you. I do have a tip to make things go a little bit faster too. We often have, and this is what our techs do, they run out survey transect tapes. So they get 100 meter transect tape. They run that out a couple times along these transect engines. It's a lot of walking back and forth. There's flexibility, and the IMMP guidebook walks through some different options to save time. One of them is to, instead of running out this huge long transect tape that can also get stuck and tangled and things, get yourself a 5 meter rope. So you're spacing these sampling plots every 5 meters. And then you only have to roll out 5 meters or pull out a 5 meter rope just between your subplots, just go, go, go. And you don't have to reel in 100 meters of tape 5 different times. So that's my little speeded up tip for you. Another component or another option is the monarch egg and larvae survey. So these broad objectives for the activity are to better understand monarch density and the timing of reproduction. You might have more specific questions. Are monarchs even reproducing here? I see milkweed. I don't know if they're using it. When are they reproducing here? And what milkweed species are they using? Well, this activity can help you answer those questions. So you're going to conduct this activity along those plant survey transects. Or if you don't want to, or you're not doing the plant survey, there are a couple other options. One of them is to run random transects. For example, you might throw a pencil in the air, start at a corner of your plot, throw a pencil in the air, walk the direction that it faces, and do a couple zigzags until you feel like you've covered the plot pretty well. There are some other options for monitoring and selecting which milkweed you monitor that I won't detail here, but they're in the protocol. So know that there's flexibility for running your transects within your plot. Now, while you're walking along these transects, what are you doing? You're recording the milkweed species that you see within 1 meter of your transect, so more or less within an arm's length. And you're looking at those milkweed for monarch eggs and larvae. You ID those larvae to instar. So there is an element of needing to know milkweed species that could be on site. Even when they're not in bloom, you need to be able to ID them, and being able to ID your larvae to instar. We have training videos on our website for both of those. So we want to make this as easy as possible to get up and running and do. This activity would take you 1 to 2 hours, depending on how much milkweed you have out there. How often do you do it? Again, as often as you'd like. A third option, a third activity, is the adult monarch survey. So our broad objectives here are to describe adult monarch presence and abundance by these land use sectors that are being surveyed, and understand resource use. You, again, might have specific objectives. You might want to know, are adult monarchs even using this site? What flowers are they nectaring on? Or are we seeing more adults use our site as we enhance the site? So this survey is pretty simple. You're going to walk 500 meters. So that in this shaped plot is just going to be around your perimeter. If you have a different shaped plot, our protocol has maps that show you exactly where you're going to walk. Usually it's just around the perimeter. You might be crossing the middle. Record the monarchs that you see within 5 meters of your transect, and record their behavior. You're also going to record any plants that they nectar on, or if you see them oviposit. This takes you about half an hour, most half an hour. How often do you do it? Again, as often as you like. So there are recommended frequencies on our guidebook and on our website, but they're not requirements. So get out there at a frequency that works for you or your volunteers. Now, I've talked about some optional activities. There's one piece of the IMMP that's not optional, and that's the site description. So every day that you go out there, whether it's 1 day a year or you're going out there every 2 weeks, every time you're out there, fill out what's called a site description. It's just a little bit of information about the management that's occurred there and some course metrics. And that just enables us to track what's going on the site and get a broad course picture of what the site is like. It is absolutely required. You cannot enter data into our data entry system unless you do the site description. So speaking of data entry, the data entry is online. You may have been familiar with the IMMP a couple years ago when we were using Survey 123. That didn't function well for our needs. So we have a pretty svelte IMMP data portal where you create a username and then register your site and enter your data there. What's forthcoming and should be ready for 2022 is this results page. So right now it just says view results. If you click on it, it says this as forthcoming. And we'll have all these metrics that people are interested in and are relevant to you. They'll be displayed right there on your site. So you log in, click view results. You'll be able to see your milkweed stem density for the site. You'll be able to see the frequency of native and non-native blooming plants. And you don't even have to know what's native or non-native. It's marked in our system based on USDA plants database. You'll have complete species lists in front of you for the site. This will calculate monarch egg and larvae per milkweed plant. So you'll have your monarch densities, adult monarchs per kilometer, and other metrics will be right there for you. So there's a little component to data entry. We can't skip this over. It does take time to enter data. Take you a couple minutes to register your username, register your site. You just have to do that once. Annually, you can record your conservation management, put in what you did last year. I did my prescribed fire last fall, did some targeted herbaceous plant removal in the midsummer. Do that once a year. And then you have your site description and any of those optional activities that doing. So depending on what you do, this can be 10 minutes to about an hour per survey. The upper end of that would only be if you're doing all of these activities and you have a very highly diverse site with a lot of species you need to enter, or a lot of monarch observations you need to enter. So data entry, if you're doing all the components, would typically takes us about 25 to 35 minutes. It'll be much less if you're just doing a subset of these activities. Now, there are some frequent concerns about the IMMP. Of course, the biggest one we hear is I don't have time to monitor. I completely understand this. We know that that's a time constraint, and that's why we've added as much flexibility as possible. So do fewer activities. Like we said, these activities are optional. Pick the ones that you're interested in. Do a lower frequency. You don't have to get out there for a weekly egg and larvae survey, but you can get out there a couple times a year. Maybe you're a little restless in the office and just want to do it in the peak season. I don't care about, or I do care about more than just blooming plants. So in our subplots, when you're walking along these transects for your plant surveys, you're recording the plants that are blooming in your subplot. We're not recording the plants that aren't actively in bloom because we're interested in what nectar resources are available right then and there for a pollinator. But a lot of people care about more than that. They want to know what plants are there even if they're not blooming on that day. You absolutely can do this. You can record plants that aren't in bloom. It turns into basically a census survey or like a meander survey. You're not going to get a frequency, a bloom frequency, but you'll have a list of every species that you can ID out there if you want to do that. So more flexibility. Okay, so someone doesn't care about blooming plants. I only need to record milkweed stem density. I only need to report it to such and so entity. Don't record blooming plants. Just do your milkweed stem density counts. Data entry is a hurdle. It takes too much time. I'm always busy. Totally understand. Contact us. Let's problem solve. I'd love to find a solution to get the data entered. We can talk about that. If you already use a certain method for surveys, well, you can actually overlay an IMMP plot on top of your existing surveys. So let's say you're using your state's butterfly monitoring protocol. You walk your trails, record all the butterflies. That's great, and we don't want to take that away from you. You keep doing, you do you. Keep doing what works. But you can also be additive here. Put an IMMP plot over that trail system and get better information on nectar plants or monarch reproduction. So there's a lot of opportunity here to retain what you're doing and add a good component. So who's using the IMMP? This is a map at the county level of sites that have been surveyed, 2016 to 2020. Excuse me. That's about 450 sites and about 300 people. And that includes staff from different research projects. And there's a lot more that has been surveyed in 2021. So how is this all getting done? This is certainly not just MJV staff out here at all these sites. People are making this happen. There's a lot of opportunity for you to make this happen too. You could write staff time into a grant, like the Rio Grande joint venture for the past couple of years. They've been writing staff time into a grant to conduct habitat surveys on some of the private lands that they're restoring and get the information that way, fund their staff time through the grant. If you're concerned, if you do a lot of work on private land, we do need waivers from private landowners to put their data into this system. If you're nervous about that, let's have a conversation. We're talking with NRCS and NIFWF, to National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, to overcome some of those hurdles. There's also an option to mask the data to a larger level. So if somebody doesn't want their location pinpointed, we can mask the data to the county level. That's totally fine. You can also contract training for volunteers, like the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin did. So they contacted Monarch Joint Venture, contracted with us for some in-person and online trainings. We managed their volunteers for the season. They ended up with 20-some volunteers and DNR staff trained, got baseline data on a half a dozen of their sites. It's a great way to get volunteers trained and have some follow-up without having to put your own staff time into it. You can partner with an academic program, like the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania and Chatham University have partnered up to do. They've teamed up for monitoring. A professor at Chatham learned the IMMP, taught it to some students, sent the students out to collect baseline data. They can use that data in their research projects, and it gets delivered to Audubon Society as well and entered into the larger IMMP database. You can also train volunteers yourselves. All of our training materials are online. We've got training videos. Our staff is here to help answer FAQs. You can also invite your volunteers to train themselves. Sometimes people just need direction. What's important to you to monitor on your sites? Ask them specifically to do a certain activity at a certain frequency. They can train themselves, or like the Butterfly Pavilion did. There's a volunteer there who is very engaged in IMMP, held a training for volunteers, is leading training at a couple sites. MJV videoed into some of their trainings to answer their FAQs, and we are happy to support your training in a similar way. So just get in touch with us. You can partner with a local conservation corps. So as an example, the Iowa Conservation Corps funded a project specifically to survey sites using the IMMP, get more information on pollinator habitat throughout Iowa. However, you don't have to have a project dedicated to pollinator habitat. Maybe you already work with a Conservation Corps crew in your area. You get them for 8 weeks in the summer. You could have them conduct a certain IMMP activity on a site or a couple sites, maybe monthly. So if you've got them for 2 months, that's just 2 surveys. It builds research skills, it builds their survey skills, plant ID skills, monarch ID skills, and it can give them a welcome break to invasive plant removal or trail building or whatever else they're doing on a regular basis. So overall, I just want you to see how flexible this program is, how impactful it can be. Ultimately, we want you to meet your monitoring needs with a tool that already exists. So there's not a need to go out and create a rapid assessment for your local landscape. You can ditch the random Excel spreadsheet that might get lost from project manager to project manager. We want you to have data that can be aggregated, and want you to contribute to a larger data set that can be explored by researchers to look at larger trends in the pollinator landscape. So with that, want to leave some time for questions and really open the doors for you to contact me at any time about how we can fit the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program into your own conservation management plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And with that, we would like to invite our participants to enter their questions into the Q&A function box. The first question is from Arlene. She asks, how can you be sure you're not counting the same monarch since they move around versus milkweed stems and monarch eggs and larvae that are stationary?
Great question, Arlene. Not the first time we've heard that. The short answer is do the best that you can to kind of keep an eye on the monarchs that are in your area. The protocol only has you recording monarchs parallel to and in front of you. So you're never looking behind you to try to record everything that's going on all around you. So that's one way that as you move forward, you're moving past monarchs. And to some extent that helps alleviate the issue. But for the most part, we're all performing the protocol in the same way. We're all doing our best to not record redundant monarchs. And so that's consistency in the effort. And the best way that we can recommend is just doing your best to not record the same monarch that's flying by.
Great, thank you. Connie asks, your example is for 5 acres or larger, and she would like to know if there are protocols for smaller sites.
Yes, there are. The protocols for sites, there's a special protocol for sites smaller than 1 acre. So if you're 1 acre and up, you'll follow pretty much the same patterns that I outlined in the talk. If your site is smaller than 1 acre, we have kind of a modified method where you still get the same type of information, just in a slightly different way you're walking around the site. So yes, you can be applied on sites smaller than 5 acres or even smaller than 1.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question is, does this data collection website also accept data on other blooming plants, not just milkweed? And what are other recommended data collection portals?
Okay, this does accept data on all blooming plants. There's, as I mentioned in the talk, there are 2 pieces. One is recording information on milkweeds and one is recording information on blooming plants. So any blooming plant on your site, whether it's blooming or not, you still have the option to record it. In terms of other portals, the only portal that I'm familiar with that might record information sort of in this way is the Prairie Reconstruction Institute has a landowner and habitat management portal that is kind of specific to, I think, the central US and targets prairie reconstruction. So isn't necessarily available to anybody anywhere on any site, but they are fine-tuning that and might be expanding it. So if this IMMP portal doesn't work for you for some reason, you might want to contact the Prairie Reconstruction Institute and see what the status of their program is.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question is from James. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts on apps like Survey123 for collecting data in the field?
Personally, I have minimal experience with that. We did use Survey123 for a couple years, and it is a great interface for people who are comfortable with smartphones or tablets. So if you're working with older volunteers, we found that was just straight up a hurdle, or people who didn't have smartphones. So we always had a paper version of our data set, and it turned out over the years that probably 90% of our users preferred the paper anyways. So we reverted to the paper. Survey123 specifically didn't meet our needs very well because we had very nested data. So in addition to having these optional activities, within each activity, you'd end up having like a drop-down box within a drop-down box within a drop-down box type of options that just became unnecessarily complicated for the user to navigate on a tablet, as well as managing on our back end. So we opted for this like SQL system and online data entry portal that we can manage the functionality a little more specifically. So my limited experience is only with Survey123 and how it didn't work for our specific needs, but it could be great for if you have a simple data collection effort that you want to train your staff to do and ensure that they have the resources like the tablet and they get the training. That could work well for you in that regard.
Fantastic, thank you. And it looks like we have time for just one more question. And the question is, how many people and what types of organizations are participating in the IMMP program?
As of that 2020 summary I had, we had over 300 people. And that doesn't even count 2021. So I imagine we're well over 350, up toward 400 people. Their organizations, a lot of them are nonprofit entities who maybe have received grants and need to track information in some way to report back to funders. A lot of academic institutions who are maybe having grad students do small projects, a high school group or two who just have kind of adopted nearby prairies near their high school, and they're just kind of integrated this into their science learning program. A good handful of volunteers, including us, a lot that have been involved since the beginning in 2017 when it kind of was in its testing phase, as well as a number of MJV staff. We do the best we can to continue a project or two each summer. So that's not a huge number of people, but we're trying to get our own staff out there as well each year.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And with that, that would conclude our fifth and final workshop in this series. Again, I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to Daniel Zay, Joe Robb, Quanit Ali, Angela VanWinden, and Jennifer Thiem for their phenomenal presentations. And again, to extend our appreciation to all of you for your participation. The full recorded series will be available for download in approximately 1 week and can be found on Pollinator Partnership's website at the same page that you registered for the workshops. Thank you again all for your interest and your contributions to pollinator and native habitat restoration and conservation.